Sarah Martinez stood in front of her bedroom mirror on that crisp Friday morning in October. She could barely contain her excitement as she folded her last clean t-shirt and placed it carefully into her small hiking backpack. After 3 months of working double shifts at Tampa General Hospital, she finally had 3 whole days off. No emergency calls, no late-night patient emergencies, and no exhausting 12-hour shifts. Just her boyfriend Jake, and the beautiful Florida wilderness. The 28-year-old nurse had been dreaming about this weekend for months. Jake had promised her the perfect camping adventure in the Fakahatchee Strand Preserve, one of Florida's most stunning but challenging wilderness areas. He had grown up exploring these very swamps with his grandfather every summer, learning to hunt, fish, and navigate through the maze of cypress trees and sawgrass marshes that stretched for thousands of acres. Sarah trusted Jake completely when it came to outdoor adventures. While she had only been hiking a few times on easy-marked trails near the city, Jake was a true outdoorsman. He could identify animal tracks in mud, knew which plants were safe to eat, and could start a fire even in wet conditions. His confidence about the wilderness was one of the things that had attracted her to him when they first met 2 years ago at a friend's barbecue party. As she packed her supplies, Sarah carefully checked each item twice. She had 2 large water bottles, enough energy bars for 3 days, a basic first aid kit with bandages and pain medicine, a flashlight with extra batteries, and warm clothes for the cool October nights. At the bottom of her pack, she placed her father's old emergency flare gun that he had insisted she carry on any wilderness trip ever since she was a teenager. Her father had been a Coast Guard rescue officer for 20 years before retiring, and he never tired of telling stories about people who got lost in the wilderness without proper emergency equipment. The flare gun was bright orange and looked like something from an old war movie. Sarah had never used it and honestly hoped she never would, but her father's voice echoed in her mind every time she went anywhere remote. "Better safe than sorry," he always said. Jake arrived at her apartment right on schedule at 9 in the morning, driving his reliable pickup truck loaded with camping gear. His enthusiasm was infectious as he showed her the new tent he had bought specifically for this trip, complete with a rainfly and extra stakes for soft ground. He had also brought a portable camp stove, sleeping bags rated for cold weather, and enough food for gourmet meals around the campfire. The weather forecast looked absolutely perfect for their adventure. Clear skies, temperatures in the comfortable 70s during the day, and cool but not cold at night. No rain expected until, at least Monday, which would be long after they returned home. Jake had been checking the forecast obsessively for 2 weeks, and everything seemed to be aligning perfectly for their romantic weekend getaway. As they loaded Sarah's pack into the truck, Jake spread out a detailed map of the preserve on his tailgate. He pointed out their planned route with the confidence of someone who had walked these trails many times before. They would hike 5 miles into the heart of the preserve along what he called the old logging road, then set up camp near a beautiful grove of ancient cypress trees that he remembered from childhood visits with his grandfather. The area Jake had chosen was famous among nature photographers for its incredible population of rare orchids, including the legendary ghost orchid that bloomed only in the deepest parts of the swamp. Sarah had brought her camera specifically to try to capture pictures of these mysterious white flowers that seemed to glow in the darkness of the forest floor. During the 2-hour drive to the preserve, Jake entertained Sarah with stories from his childhood adventures. His grandfather had taught him to navigate by watching the position of the sun and identifying certain landmark trees. He knew how to find fresh water by following animal trails, how to identify which berries were safe to eat, and most importantly, how to stay calm and think clearly if things went wrong in the wilderness. Sarah found these stories both fascinating and slightly intimidating. She had grown up in suburban Tampa, and her idea of outdoor adventure was usually limited to beach, walks, and city park picnics. But Jake's confidence was reassuring, and she felt excited about pushing herself to try something completely new and challenging. The landscape gradually changed as they drove further from the city. Suburban shopping centers and housing developments gave way to rural farmland, then to vast stretches of wetlands and scattered patches of forest. Sarah watched out the window as they passed through small towns with names she had never heard before, each one seeming more remote than the last. By the time they reached the preserve entrance, Sarah felt like she was entering a completely different world. Towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss created a natural cathedral along both sides of the narrow access road. The air smelled rich and earthy, filled with the scents of plants and water and wild growing things that she could not identify. They parked at a small gravel lot that served as the trailhead for several hiking routes into the preserve. Jake shouldered his large pack with practiced ease, while Sarah struggled slightly with the weight of her smaller but still substantial load. The October sun felt warm on her face as they stood at the edge of the wilderness, ready to begin what Jake promised would be the adventure of a lifetime. Looking back later, Sarah would remember this moment as the last time she felt completely safe and optimistic about their weekend plans. The trail ahead looked well-maintained and clearly marked. Jake seemed completely confident about their route, and she felt excited about spending 3 days disconnected from the stress and demands of her hospital job. As they took their first steps into the preserve, Sarah had no way of knowing that this would be the beginning of the most terrifying and life-changing experience she would ever face. The beautiful wilderness that stretched out ahead of them held dangers that neither of them had anticipated, and before the weekend was over, she would be fighting for her very survival in ways she could never have imagined. The first hour of hiking felt like a dream come true for Sarah. The trail that Jake confidently led her down was wide and well-defined, winding through some of the most beautiful scenery she had ever experienced. Massive cypress trees towered above them like ancient giants, their thick trunks rising straight up toward the canopy before spreading into branches draped with flowing Spanish moss that created a natural curtain around them. Sarah stopped frequently to take pictures with her camera, amazed by the way sunlight filtered through the moss and leaves to create patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. The air was filled with the sounds of birds she could not identify, their calls echoing mysteriously through the trees. Occasionally, she would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, but when she turned to look, she would see only the gentle swaying of plants in the breeze. Jake walked ahead of her with the easy confidence of someone who had traveled these paths many times before. He pointed out interesting plants and trees along the way, sharing knowledge that his grandfather had passed down to him during countless childhood expeditions. He showed her how to identify the difference between cypress and oak trees by their bark patterns, and how to spot the signs that indicated they were walking through areas that flooded regularly during the rainy season. As they walked deeper into the preserve, the trail began to change in ways that Sarah noticed but did not immediately worry about. What had started as a clear path wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side gradually became narrower and less defined. The wooden trail markers that had been visible every few hundred yards near the parking area became fewer and farther. Between and some of the ones they did find were so weathered that the writing was impossible to read. Jake seemed unconcerned by these changes, continuing to walk forward with the same steady pace and confident demeanor. When Sarah asked him about the condition of the trail, he explained that many of the paths in the preserve were maintained by volunteers rather than Park Service employees, so they were not always kept in perfect condition. The important thing, he assured her, was to stay on the main route and not get distracted by the smaller animal trails that branched off in various directions. By the 3rd hour of their hike, however, Sarah began to feel genuinely worried about their situation. The trail had essentially disappeared completely, leaving them walking through ankle-deep water between cypress trees with no clear indication of which direction they should be heading. Jake had stopped his confident commentary about the landscape. and was spending increasing amounts of time staring at his phone, trying to make sense of the GPS display that showed their location as nothing more than a green blob with no roads, trails, or landmarks visible. The water around their feet was getting deeper with each step they took, and Sarah could feel the cold liquid seeping through her hiking boots, despite their waterproof coating. Her feet were becoming uncomfortably wet and cold, and she was beginning to worry about blisters forming from walking in soggy socks. More concerning was the fact that she had no idea how much deeper the water might become if they continued in their current direction. When Jake finally stopped walking and admitted that he was not entirely sure where they were, Sarah felt the first real flutter of panic in her chest. The preserve covered more than 80,000 acres of some of the most challenging terrain in Florida, and they had been walking for hours without seeing another person or any signs of human activity. If they were truly lost, they could wander for days without finding their way back to the parking area. Jake tried to reassure her by explaining that they could not be too far from the main trail and that all they needed to do was backtrack until they found familiar territory. But when they turned around and began trying to retrace their steps, Sarah realized, with growing alarm, that everything behind them looked exactly the same as everything in front of them. The landscape of cypress trees, Spanish moss, and dark water repeated endlessly in every direction, with no distinguishing features that would help them identify which way they had come. As afternoon began turning toward evening, their situation became increasingly desperate. Jake had developed a noticeable limp after stepping awkwardly on a submerged log and twisting his ankle badly. Sarah could see that he was in pain, though he was trying to hide it from her to avoid making her more worried than she already was. Every step seemed to cause him discomfort, and his pace had slowed considerably from the confident stride he had maintained during the first part of their hike. The temperature was beginning to drop as the sun moved lower in the sky, and Sarah realized that they would soon be facing the prospect of spending a night in the swamp without proper shelter. Their camping gear was designed for use at established campsites with dry ground and protection from wind, not for emergency situations in standing water surrounded by potentially dangerous wildlife. Sarah had never felt so vulnerable and exposed in her life. Every sound in the forest around them seemed magnified and threatening, from the splash of something large moving through water somewhere nearby to the strange calls of birds and animals that became more active as darkness approached. She found herself jumping at shadows and movements that turned out to be nothing more than Spanish moss swaying in the breeze, when Jake finally suggested that they should stop moving and wait for morning rather than risk becoming even more lost. In the darkness, Sarah knew that their romantic weekend adventure had become something much more serious and potentially dangerous. They found a small area of relatively solid ground beneath a large cypress tree and began preparing for what would be the longest and most frightening night of Sarah's life. As they shared their limited food and water, both of them were thinking the same thoughts that neither wanted to voice aloud. They were completely lost in a vast wilderness area with no way to call for help, limited supplies, and no clear plan for how to find their way back to safety. The perfect weekend that had begun with such excitement and optimism had become a struggle for survival that would test everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The night in the swamp had been worse than Sarah could have ever imagined. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness around them constantly, from the deep, bellowing calls of alligators somewhere in the distance to the splash and movement of creatures they could not see but knew were close by. Every time Sarah managed to drift off to sleep, a new sound would jolt her awake, her heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. Jake had barely slept at all due to the throbbing pain in his ankle, which had swollen to nearly twice its normal size during the night. When morning finally came, Sarah could see that his injury was much worse than either of them had initially realized. The ankle was not only swollen but had turned an alarming shade of purple and blue, and Jake could barely put any weight on it without wincing in obvious pain. Despite his injury, Jake insisted that they had to try to walk out of the swamp rather than wait for rescue that might never come. Sarah knew he was right about their situation being desperate, but she was terrified about attempting to navigate through the difficult terrain when Jake could barely walk. They had already proven the night before that they had no idea which direction would lead them back to the parking area and safety. Sarah helped Jake to his feet, and they began the slow and painful process of trying to find their way out of the wilderness. Jake leaned heavily on Sarah's shoulder, and she could feel how much effort it took for him to move forward with each step. Their progress was agonizingly slow, with frequent stops for Jake to rest and for both of them to try to figure out which direction they should be heading. They had been walking for about an hour, with Sarah supporting most of Jake's weight, when they spotted what appeared to be solid dry ground ahead of them through the trees. After spending the night on the small patch of slightly elevated mud beneath the cypress tree, the prospect of finding truly dry land seemed like the first piece of good luck they had encountered since getting lost. Jake pointed toward the area, with obvious relief, explaining to Sarah that if they could reach dry ground, they would have a much better chance of finding their way back to the main trail system. Dry land in the preserve usually indicated higher elevation, which often connected to the ridge systems that the official hiking trails followed. Sarah felt a surge of hope as they slowly made their way toward what looked like their salvation. The ground ahead of them appeared solid and covered with the kind of vegetation that typically grew in areas that did not flood regularly. Sarah could see what looked like palmetto bushes and pine trees mixed in with the cypress, which Jake explained was a good sign that they were moving toward the edge of the swamp area. As they got closer, both of them began to feel optimistic that they might finally be heading in the right direction. Jake was so focused on reaching the dry ground that he did not notice the subtle signs that should have warned him about the danger ahead. The vegetation that had looked so promising from a distance was actually growing on what appeared to be solid soil, but was really a thin crust covering a hidden sinkhole that had been formed by underground water flow over many years. When Jake stepped onto what he thought was firm ground, the earth beneath him gave way completely without any warning. Sarah watched in horror as Jake suddenly plunged through what had looked like solid soil into dark water that appeared to have no bottom. The splash echoed through the trees around them, and then there was a terrible silence that filled Sarah with more fear than she had ever experienced in her life. Sarah threw herself forward toward the edge of the hole, desperately trying to grab Jake before he disappeared completely beneath the surface. She managed to catch hold of a thick cypress root just as the edge of the sinkhole began crumbling under her own weight, leaving her hanging partially over the dark water where Jake had vanished. For several terrifying seconds, she could see nothing but black water reflecting the sky above. Finally, Sarah heard Jake's voice calling weakly from somewhere in the darkness below her. He was alive, but she could tell immediately that he was in serious trouble. His voice sounded strange and strained, and she could hear him struggling to keep his head above water. When she called down to him asking if he was hurt, his responses were confused and difficult to understand. Jake explained in short, gasping sentences that he was trapped under something heavy at the bottom of the sinkhole, possibly fallen logs or debris that had accumulated there over many years. He had managed to find a small air pocket that was keeping him from drowning, but he could not free himself from whatever was holding him down, and the water was so dark that he could not see anything around him. Sarah tried everything she could think of to help him. She lowered her belt down into the hole, then tied together pieces of clothing to make a longer rope, but nothing was long enough to reach Jake or strong enough to pull him up even if it could. She searched frantically for branches or vines that might work better, but everything she found was either too short, too weak, or too rotten to be useful. As the hours passed, Jake's voice became weaker and his responses to Sarah's calls became less frequent. She could tell that he was losing strength and struggling more and more to keep his head above water in whatever small space he had found. The most terrifying part was that there was absolutely nothing she could do to help him with the limited resources she had available. By late afternoon, Jake had stopped responding to Sarah's calls entirely. She continued calling his name and trying different ways to reach him, but the terrible silence from the dark water below told her what she did not want to accept. The person she loved was gone, and she was now completely alone in a vast wilderness, with no idea how to find her way back to civilization. The silence that followed Jake's last weak response was the most terrifying sound Sarah had ever experienced. She had been calling his name for hours, lowering makeshift ropes made from her clothes and belt, and desperately searching for anything that might help her reach him in the dark water below. But now there was nothing but the gentle lapping of water against the sides of the sinkhole, and the distant calls of birds that seemed to mock her desperate situation. Sarah refused to believe that Jake was really gone. She continued calling down into the hole, her voice becoming hoarse and ragged from hours of shouting. She tried different tones, sometimes calling softly in case he was unconscious and might respond to a gentler voice, sometimes screaming as loudly as she could in case he was trapped somewhere deeper than she had realized. But the dark water below reflected only her own face and the gray sky above. As evening approached, Sarah was forced to accept the horrible reality of her situation. Not only had she lost the person she loved most in the world, but she was now completely alone in one of the most dangerous wilderness areas in Florida, with no idea how to find her way back to safety. The preserve covered more than 80,000 acres of swamp, forest, and wetland, and she could be anywhere within that vast area. Her phone had been showing no signal since they first got lost the day before, and the battery was now down to less than 15%. Even if she could find a signal, she realized that she would not be able to tell rescuers where she was located since she had no idea herself. The GPS function showed her position as a small dot surrounded by green space with no roads, trails, or landmarks visible for miles in any direction. Sarah took inventory of her remaining supplies with growing alarm. She had already eaten the last of her energy bars that morning, and her water supply was running dangerously low. One of her water bottles was completely empty, and the other contained maybe 2 or 3 sips at most. She had not eaten anything substantial in over 24 hours, and her body was already beginning to feel the effects of dehydration and hunger. More immediate than her supply problems was the fact that she had absolutely no idea which direction to travel to find help. Every direction looked identical to her inexperienced eyes, with endless stretches of cypress trees, Spanish moss, and dark water extending to the horizon. Without Jake's outdoor knowledge to guide her, she had no way to navigate using the sun or stars, no ability to identify which plants might provide water or food, and no understanding of which areas of the swamp were safe to travel through. Sarah forced herself to think rationally about her situation, despite her grief and growing panic. She knew that search and rescue teams would eventually come looking for them when they failed to return home Sunday evening as planned. Jake had told several people about their camping trip, and his absence from work on Monday would definitely be noticed by his supervisor and co-workers. But Sarah also realized that even when searchers began looking for them, finding her would be incredibly difficult. The preserve was enormous, and she and Jake had gotten lost so completely that they could be anywhere within its boundaries. Search teams would have to cover thousands of acres of some of the most challenging terrain in the state, and they would have no way of knowing which areas to focus on first. She decided that her best chance of survival was to try to save herself, rather than wait for rescue that might take days or weeks to find her. Using her phone's compass function before the battery died completely, Sarah chose what she hoped was the direction that would take her back toward the main trail system and the parking area where they had left Jake's truck. The journey through. The swamp was even more difficult alone than it had been when she was helping support Jake's weight. The water was often waist-deep, forcing her to half-swim while trying to keep her backpack and remaining supplies dry above her head. Her hiking boots, which had seemed so practical and comfortable when she put them on that morning, were now completely waterlogged and making walking incredibly difficult. Worse than the physical challenges were the psychological ones. Every sound in the forest around her seemed threatening and dangerous now that she was alone. She found herself jumping at the splash of fish or turtles, the calls of birds she could not identify, and the movement of Spanish moss in the breeze. That looked like something watching her from the shadows between the trees. As her second night in the swamp approached, Sarah was becoming seriously concerned about her physical condition. She had not eaten anything in over 36 hours, and her last sips of water were gone. She had found some rainwater collected in the hollow of a dead tree, but she knew from her medical training that drinking untreated water from the swamp could make her violently ill with bacteria or parasites that would make her situation even more desperate. The cuts and scratches on her legs from thorns and sharp sawgrass were beginning to show signs of infection from exposure to the dirty water she had been walking through. Several of the wounds were red and swollen, and she could feel the beginnings of fever that indicated her body was fighting off infection. Without proper medical treatment, she knew that infection could quickly become life-threatening in her weakened condition. Most frustrating of all were the helicopters she had been hearing periodically throughout the day. The sound of aircraft engines in the distance confirmed that search and rescue operations were underway, but the thick canopy of trees above her made it impossible for anyone in the helicopters to see her even when they passed almost directly overhead. She had tried waving her bright red jacket and shouting, but she knew that her voice could not carry over the noise of the engines, and the searchers had no way to see through the dense forest canopy. As darkness fell on her second night alone, in the swamp, Sarah found a small patch of ground that was only ankle-deep in water and tried to rest. She was exhausted, hungry, dehydrated, and beginning to show signs of serious illness. But she knew that she had to find a way to signal for help soon, or she would not survive much longer in the wilderness. Sunday morning brought Sarah to the edge of complete despair. She had now been lost in the swamp for more than 48 hours, and her body was shutting down from dehydration, hunger, and infection. When she tried to stand up from her resting place, her legs shook uncontrollably, and she had to grab onto a cypress tree to keep from falling back into the water. Her vision was becoming blurry, and she was experiencing periods of confusion that she recognized as dangerous symptoms of severe dehydration. The infected cuts on her legs had gotten much worse during the night. Several of them were now bright, red and swollen, with red streaks extending up toward her thighs that indicated the infection was spreading through her bloodstream. She had a fever that made her feel alternately hot and cold, and her thinking was becoming fuzzy and unclear. She knew from her medical training that she was approaching the point where her body would simply shut down if she did not get help soon. The sound of helicopters had continued throughout the night and early morning, sometimes seeming close enough that she could almost make out the individual beats of the rotor blades. Each time she heard an aircraft approaching, Sarah would struggle to her feet and wave her jacket frantically above her head, screaming for help until her voice gave out. But the searchers had no way to see her through the thick canopy of cypress, branches and Spanish moss that blocked almost all view of the ground from above. Sarah had tried everything she could think of to make herself visible to the search teams. She had used the last of her phone's battery power to create flashing signals with the screen light. She had arranged her bright-colored clothing in patterns on the ground that might be visible from above if anyone could see through the trees. She had even tried building a signal fire, but everything in the swamp was too wet to burn, and she had no way to create enough smoke to rise above the tree canopy. It was then that Sarah remembered the emergency flare gun that her father had insisted she carry, still tucked away in the bottom of her backpack. The bright orange device looked exactly like the one her father had shown her how to use when she was a teenager, though she had never actually fired it. The flare gun contained only one shot, a single red emergency flare designed to create a bright signal that would be visible for miles even in daylight conditions. Sarah pulled the flare gun from her pack with trembling hands and examined it carefully. The device was simple in design, with a trigger mechanism similar to a regular gun and a single chamber that held the flare cartridge. Her father had explained to her years ago that emergency flares burned at extremely high temperatures and created an intensely bright light that could be seen from aircraft flying at normal altitudes during both day and night conditions. But as Sarah looked up at the thick canopy of trees above her, she realized there was a critical problem with using the flare in her current location. The branches and Spanish moss were so thick that even a flare shot straight up would likely get caught in the vegetation long before reaching a height where aircraft could see it. She needed to find an opening in the trees, but that would mean leaving the relative safety of her current position and venturing into even more dangerous areas of the swamp. Sarah spent precious hours that morning searching for any gap in the canopy that might give a flare shot a clear path to the sky above. She was growing weaker by the hour, and she knew that she might not have the physical strength for much more searching or walking. Every step was becoming more difficult, and she had to rest frequently to keep from collapsing completely. Finally, after what felt like miles of struggling through waist-deep water, Sarah spotted what appeared to be a clearing in the forest, about 200 yards away from her current location. From her position, she could see a patch of blue sky visible through what looked like a gap in the tree canopy. It appeared that lightning or strong winds had brought down several large trees in that area, creating a natural opening that extended all the way up to the open sky above. The clearing represented Sarah's best and probably only chance of successfully signaling for help, but reaching it would require crossing some of the deepest and most dangerous water she had encountered since getting lost. Between her current position and the opening in the trees, she could see areas where the water appeared to be chest-deep or deeper, and she had no way of knowing what kinds of creatures might be living in the dark water. Sarah knew that alligators were common throughout the preserve, and she had heard them calling during both nights she had spent in the swamp. She had also seen several water moccasins, poisonous snakes that could deliver potentially fatal bites to anyone who disturbed them while moving through their territory. The thought of crossing through deep water where she could not see what was swimming around her feet was terrifying, but she also knew that this might be her only opportunity to save her own life. As she prepared to make the dangerous journey to the clearing, Sarah could hear another helicopter approaching in the distance. The sound was getting louder, which meant the aircraft was heading in her general direction. She realized that the timing of her signal would be critical. If she fired the flare too early, the helicopter would be too far away to see it. If she waited too long, the aircraft would be gone before the flare reached its peak height and brightness. Sarah checked the flare gun one more time to make sure it was loaded properly, then began the terrifying journey toward the opening in the trees. She knew that she would have only one chance to get this right. If she missed the gap in the canopy, or if the flare malfunctioned, or if the helicopter was too far away to see the signal, she would have no other way to call for help. This was her last desperate attempt to save herself before her body gave up completely. The sound of the approaching helicopter was getting closer, and Sarah forced herself to move as quickly as possible through the deep water toward the clearing. She could feel things brushing against her legs in the murky water, and twice she had to carefully navigate around alligators that watched her with cold, calculating eyes. But she kept moving toward the patch of blue sky that represented her only hope of survival. Sarah had never been more terrified in her life as she struggled through the chest-deep water toward the clearing. Every step forward was a battle against exhaustion, dehydration, and the fear of what might be lurking in the dark water around her. She held the flare gun high above her head with both hands, determined to keep it dry despite the fact that the water was now reaching almost to her shoulders in some areas. The journey that had looked like only 200 yards from a distance turned out to be much longer and more dangerous than she had anticipated. The water became so deep in some places that she had to swim while trying to keep the flare gun above the surface, which drained her remaining energy even faster. Her waterlogged clothes and boots felt like they weighed 100 pounds, dragging her down and making every movement more difficult. Twice during the crossing, Sarah encountered alligators that were much larger and more aggressive than the ones she had seen before. The first one was sunning itself on a partially submerged log directly in her path, and she had to make a wide detour that added precious minutes to her journey. The second alligator actually began following her through the water, staying about 20 feet behind her but clearly tracking her movement through its territory. Sarah tried not to panic about the alligator, remembering stories Jake had told her about how the creatures usually avoided humans unless they felt threatened or were protecting their nests. She moved as slowly and quietly as possible, trying not to create splashing or sudden movements that might provoke an attack. But she could feel the massive predator watching her, and she knew that if she fell or showed any sign of weakness, it might decide she was easy prey. When she finally reached the edge of the clearing, Sarah was so exhausted that she could barely stand upright. Her legs were shaking uncontrollably from the effort of the crossing, and she had to lean against a fallen tree trunk to keep from collapsing completely. But she could see that her desperate plan had a chance of working. The opening in the forest canopy was even larger than it had appeared from a distance, with a clear view of blue sky stretching at least 50 feet in diameter above the fallen trees. The sound of the helicopter was getting much closer now, and Sarah could tell that the aircraft was heading almost directly toward her location. This was the moment she had been hoping for, but she realized that the timing would have to be perfect. The flare would burn brightly, but only for a limited time, and she would need to fire it when the helicopter was close enough to see the signal, but not so close that the flare would burn out before the pilots could react and change course. Sarah raised the flare gun toward the patch of open sky above her and tried to steady her shaking hands. Her father had shown her how to use the device when she was younger, but she had never actually fired it, and she was not entirely sure what to expect. The weight of the flare gun felt reassuring in her grip, but she knew that she would have only one chance to get this right. The helicopter sound grew louder and more distinct, and Sarah could tell that it was almost directly overhead. She waited until she judged the aircraft was at the perfect distance, then took a deep breath and pulled the trigger. The flare gun kicked harder than she had expected, nearly knocking her backward into the water, but she watched with amazement as the bright red flare streaked up through the opening and exploded into brilliant light against the blue sky above. For what felt like an eternity, Sarah watched the flare burn against the sky like a miniature sun, casting red light down through the forest canopy and creating the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. The flare seemed to hang in the air forever, though she knew it was actually falling slowly back toward Earth as it continued to burn with intense brightness that would be visible for miles in every direction. The change in the helicopter's sound told Sarah immediately that her desperate plan had worked. The steady rhythm of the rotor blades shifted as the aircraft banked sharply and began circling her location. Within seconds, she could hear voices calling from above, and she knew that the search team had spotted her signal and was preparing to attempt a rescue from her position in the clearing. Sarah collapsed to her knees in the shallow water at the edge of the clearing, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude that almost made her pass out completely. She had done it. After more than 50 hours alone in one of the most dangerous wilderness areas in Florida, facing dehydration, infection, exhaustion, and complete despair, she had managed to signal for help at exactly the right moment with exactly the right equipment. The rescue itself happened with amazing speed and efficiency. Within minutes of spotting her flare, the helicopter crew had lowered a rescue harness through the opening in the trees and was pulling Sarah up toward safety. As she rose above the forest canopy for the first time in days, she could see the vast expanse of wilderness that had nearly claimed her life stretching to the horizon in every direction. The rescue team told her later that her flare had been visible from more than 10 miles away, and that it had led them directly to her exact location after more than 30 hours of searching. Without that single, perfectly timed shot, they explained, she might never have been found in the enormous preserve. The thick forest canopy had made it impossible for them to see her from the air despite flying search patterns over the area where her car had been found. 3 hours after her rescue, Sarah was lying in a hospital bed receiving intravenous fluids for severe dehydration and antibiotics for the serious infections that had developed in her leg wounds. The doctors told her that she had been within hours of complete physical collapse when the rescue team found her, and that waiting much longer to seek help might have been fatal. Jake's body was recovered from the sinkhole 2 days later by a specialized rescue team equipped with underwater recovery equipment. The investigation revealed that the hidden sinkhole was more than 30 feet deep and had been a death trap for unwary travelers for many years. Sarah attended his funeral a week later, still recovering from her ordeal, but grateful to be alive, to honor his memory. The experience changed Sarah forever, but it also proved to her that survival sometimes comes down to a single moment when everything depends on making the right decision with the right equipment at exactly the right time. Her father's old flare gun, which she had carried reluctantly and hoped never to use, had saved her life with one perfectly aimed shot that turned her darkest moment into the beginning of her rescue and recovery.